Another criticism is launched pretty directly at the mysticism or supernaturalism in deep ecology. And Bookchin here quotes from a feminist theorist, Chaya Heller, who calls this eco-la-la. So that's supposed to be a kind of making fun of um, the mysticism, that there's something about the ecological or the world, the global nature that is mysterious and that commands awe and wonder from us, and that we would sort of go into our relation with nature or our environmental activism with a kind of spiritually blown mind. And this to Bookchin is very suspicious, as it is to Heller. A few things to note here are that the nature deities of the deep ecologists, things like an earth goddess, for instance. Remember that not directly a member of deep ecology, but a member of Earth First, Dave Foreman had in his principles included the claim that Earth is a goddess and proper object of worship. But notice that these deities, often when someone proposes that nature be considered as a kind of god or a spiritual entity, they personify nature first. So even the idea of nature as a goddess is making, or Earth as a goddess, is making nature into a human thing. It's thinking of nature as something human prior to worship. So there's a kind of, paradoxically, there's a kind of anthropocentrism in the imagination of nature as something spiritual, something fitting human values and human, causes for admiration. Another problem with this spiritualism or mysticism, which is a problem that one can claim is connected to or arises from any kind of spiritualism or mysticism or religious commitment or affiliation, is that because all those things have to do with faith and personal experience, and they kind of stand outside of the realm of what we can evaluate with more objective means, like, for instance, something that could be interpersonally observed or could be tested in science. Those kinds of ways of thinking, like spiritualist or religious ways of thinking, tend to be less subject to critical thinking or reasoning. So they tend to, as Bookchin describes it, they tend to kind of shut down or short circuit people's ability to think critically about some subject matter. And I think Bookchin's position is that in order to address environmental problems effectively, we would need to use a lot of critical thinking and reasoning, that we don't want to short circuit our critical thinking and reasoning for addressing either environmental problems or social problems or any kind of problem that we as humans face. That critical thinking and reasoning are good things that help us find the right solution and help us avoid problems. And so any philosophy or any approach to environmental issues that short circuits that through a kind of mysticism or supernaturalism is, from his standpoint, problematic. Another criticism he makes briefly is that Arne Naess originally worked in the philosophical tradition of positivism, which is, this is a bit of a complicated historical point, but basically these were philosophers who wanted to be more scientific in their reasoning. It's interesting that Bookchin makes this criticism. This is another one that isn't that convincing to me, because, I mean, for one thing, Bookchin himself wants to be scientific, as mentioned in the last criticism that I just summarized, and so I'm not really sure why he thinks of positivism as such an enemy of his way of thinking. And it's also perhaps noteworthy that many positivists were themselves very left-leaning, or even were socialists or communists of some kind. I don't know about anarchist positivist, but probably there have been such as well. So anyway, for whatever reason, I'm not that convinced by this criticism, and it's not that important for our purposes. So I'll just move on. Another point that Bookchin makes is that just being eco or ecologically conscious, okay, doesn't guarantee that whatever society or set of policies one develops from that, pro-eco, ecocentric, or ecologically conscious position is going to be non-oppressive. And interestingly, Arne Naess, in his statement of principles from 1973, at least acknowledged this enough to include the anti-class posture explicitly as one of his principles. So Arne Naess felt the need to say, in order to be a deep ecologist, you need to be opposed to oppression in any form. But by 1985, in those principles, remember, we noticed that that stipulation was dropped out. And so Bookchin's criticism here seems to apply to the 1985 principles, but it may not apply to the 1973 Arne Naess principles. But the basic criticism that Bookchin is making here is that one could be ecologically responsible, sustainable, conscious. One could revere nature itself as a god, as was the case, for instance, in Egypt with the Nile, ancient Egypt with the Nile River. It was considered a kind of deity. But in ancient Egypt, it's thought on the basis of the best history of that time that it was slave labor that was employed to build, for instance, the pyramids. So it was an incredibly hierarchical and oppressive society, even though it was also perhaps in the deep ecologist sense, a very ecologically conscious society. And this is just to point out that if we think that oppression is a bad thing, we can't get rid of oppression just by becoming more ecologically conscious. We need to also pay attention to oppression directly. Another criticism is that the way that humans are described in deep ecology often ignores that they are special kinds of animals in the sense that they have what Bookchin calls a second nature. That is, that it's natural for humans to be social, to have culture, and to engage in reasoning about things, to change their behavior on the basis of their understanding of how things work and their developing understanding, or their understanding, which can be informed by new information and new reasons and new arguments. And so as long as there have been humans on Bookchin's picture of what humans are and are like, as long as there have been humans, they've argued with each other about what the best way to live is. And sometimes they've convinced one another or convinced entire groups of humans to live in a different way from what they otherwise would have. And if we don't recognize these features of humans, that they are social and rational and that they can change their behavior, then this will have some problematic consequences for how we think about humans and their relation to nature and how we think about the best ways to confront environmental problems. If we don't recognize that humans can change their behavior on the basis of being convinced by good reasons, then it's easier to think of humans as a kind of mortal enemy of the environment, that there's something in human nature that can't be changed and that inevitably leads to a conflict with environmental systems. And that would easily lead to something like ecofascism, thinking of humans or most humans as the enemy and as something to be cut back or eradicated, reduced in numbers of population, and so on. And so that's a worry. But there are also these other two worries listed on the slide, that not recognizing this feature of humans actually gives a distorted picture of nature as well, because then nature is not understood as something that can include a being that is inherently or naturally social, cultural, and rational. And it also, and so part of what Bookchin's pointing out here is a similar point to what Sober pointed out, that if humans are a part of nature and it's natural for humans to exercise rationality and have societies and culture, then to some extent, we need to recognize that those features of human life and the outgrowths of those features of human life in, say, human technologies and architecture and so on, are part of nature also, and can arguably be thought of as something that should be conserved or should be protected and respected within nature. They're one part of nature, not the whole of nature, but one part of nature. And so if you understand that they're a part of nature too, then there's some additional argument for respecting them and thinking of them as worthy of respect, like other natural products and processes are. And then the second point listed on the slide here about this second problem that arises with this failing to recognize humans' second nature is that it would lead to theorists to not notice an important resource for actually addressing environmental problems, which is precisely human beings' ability to shape their societies differently. The effect of human culture on individual human decision-making, the effect of rationality and rational argument and reflection on, what would be a consistent and defensible way of interacting with each other and with the environment. Rational argument, rational problem solving. If you don't recognize that these things are a part of what humans can do, then you are in a way removing from your toolbox those things as resources for protecting nature. And very arguably, human problem-solving ability and the human ability to reshape their societies and their behavior in accordance with what they have become convinced makes the most sense. Those resources are going to be really crucial to us being able to effectively address environmental issues. Think, for instance, about the protection of species that are already endangered. Is the best way to protect endangered species to become very spiritual and mystical and try to return human beings to a complete kind of unity of consciousness with nature and eliminate their rationality and the more sophisticated aspects of human culture like technology? Is it to try to eliminate human second nature and have humans return to a more animalistic condition? Is that the best way to protect endangered species? Or is it rather to be more thoughtful and perhaps use better and better scientific instruments like study and data collection to be able to protect species in the most effective way? Maybe we want to use genetic science to help us make decisions about what's the best way to repopulate the tiger species or repopulate whale species. If we shut down our rationality and our culture, then we would be eliminating crucial resources for addressing those problems. Another criticism is that deep ecology really actually has no developed account of society. They don't have a story about how human societies came to the point of facing the environmental problems that they do, how they came to the point of, say, manipulating nature and exploiting resources in nature to the point that they pushed various natural processes to a kind of limit that was that ended up endangering their own survival and that of other species. The fact that humans did that they developed those technologies and that they developed those social institutions that allowed them to exploit nature to that point is, from Bookchin's perspective, a development in human history. It's a development in human societies. And deep ecology has almost nothing to say, based on the 1985 book, about how human societies came to that point, which means that they haven't really diagnosed in terms of the social factors. And Bookchin's sense is those social factors are really, really important, maybe even the most important part of how we got to this place. They haven't diagnosed the social factors that have led to us getting to this place. And so that's a big problem. And there are other problems as well with their having such a limited understanding or account of society itself. For instance, that shows up in their failure to recognize humans second nature, as was mentioned in the last slide.